On this slide, we can see a diagram of the details of lactic acid fermentation. Starting in the upper left corner, we see glucose entering into the 10-step process of glycolysis. The glucose molecule is going through catabolism. It's being broken down into pyruvate. Along the way, we are making a little bit of ATP through substrate level phosphorylation. And the electrons that are being released from the glucose are being accepted by NAD+ to make NADH. The pyruvate molecule, instead of going into pyruvate processing, is going to be shunted down into another metabolic reaction, into this fermentation process. And the pyruvate here will be converted into lactate or lactic acid. Along the way, the NADH will donate its electrons to pyruvate, and NAD+ will be regenerated. Remember that humans and other animals can do lactic acid fermentation. Anaerobic microbial organisms can also do lactic acid fermentation, at least some of them. Now I want to say a few words about lactic acid fermentation in humans, because lactic acid, as an acid, is actually a painful product to have in your cells. In fact, lactic acid is what's responsible for some of the pain that's felt in skeletal muscle during very strenuous exercise. Lactic acid is not going to remain, though, as a molecule that persists in human cells. The lactic acid will be metabolized within several hours, typically within about 1 day of being formed through fermentation. A lot of people think about lactic acid as being the reason that their muscles are sore after they exercise strenuously. And in reality, that's not quite the reason. Yes, lactic acid is formed during fermentation, and while an athlete is performing at a very strenuous level and fermenting a little bit, that lactic acid will cause some pain, some discomfort in the muscle. But the muscle soreness that occurs a couple of days after strenuous exercise is not due to lactic acid. At that point, the lactic acid that was made will be metabolized away. It will be gone. Instead, that soreness that you get in your muscles is created through a different process. This gets a name. It's called DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness. And the DOMS reaction is actually due to a little bit of damage that's created in the skeletal muscle during strenuous exercise. It's the result of an overextension and an overflexion of skeletal muscle beyond its capacity. In other words, it's the athlete pushing their skeletal muscle beyond their level of fitness. What happens is, on a microscopic level inside the skeletal muscle, there is a unit of contraction called the sarcomere. And if you've ever taken an anatomy and physiology class, you know what a sarcomere is. It's basically the functional unit of contraction in skeletal muscle. And it's the sarcomere that physically gets shorter or longer as muscle contracts and relaxes. It's possible to contract and relax a sarcomere beyond its abilities, though. You can get these little micro tears as you damage your sarcomeres during particularly strenuous exercise. So DOMS is actually the result of inflammation due to skeletal muscle damage, micro damage, after strenuous exercise. So what exactly happens to the lactic acid that gets produced when human cells do fermentation? Well, essentially, it just gets turned around and metabolized back to pyruvate. And there are a couple of different processes that are going on when a cell gets rid of lactic acid. So if you look at this slide, you can see that inside skeletal muscle cells, the glucose is being converted to pyruvate through glycolysis and then fermented to lactate or lactic acid. That lactic acid will be metabolized again within about 24 hours by first traveling to the liver and being rerouted back to pyruvate. Now, the fate of this pyruvate will vary depending on the circumstances at the moment, but one of the ways that this pyruvate is changed is to send it back to glucose. This is a process called gluconeogenesis. And if you translate that word, it means the production of new glucose. Gluconeogenesis. So pyruvate and some energy in the form of ATP will be sent back through a series of reactions, gluconeogenesis, to form glucose once again. So remember, when we talk about humans doing lactic acid fermentation, when we talk about humans and other animals, we're talking about the human exerting themselves beyond their capacity. It's not that, they've had a heart attack and they've dropped to the floor and they're not breathing at all. We're talking about athletes that are performing at a level where they simply cannot get enough oxygen to keep doing that high amount of cellular respiration. Remember, they need ATP in order to perform at this high level, and they need enough oxygen to be there at the bottom of the electron transport chain as cellular respiration rates are ramped up. So if you think about, for example, an Olympic level athlete, an Olympic level sprinter, when that athlete does a sprint, they are not breathing while they're running, because if they take a breath, it will actually slow them down a fraction of a second. So while they are doing that sprint and exerting all that energy, burning through all that ATP, they're not taking in any more oxygen. And yes, this is only going on for a few seconds, but the cells will need to ferment in those few seconds. They'll need to take the pyruvate and direct it down a different pathway to lactic acid. That's why when you watch these high-level, high-performing athletes at the end of a race, you'll often see a trainer coming along and working their muscles, doing a massage to help move that lactic acid into the bloodstream so that it can be metabolized and gotten rid of more quickly. I also want to point out that there are other reasons that lactic acid can build up in the body. It's not just through vigorous exercise. There are disease states in humans and other animals that will cause their cells to ferment. This is a process that creates what's known as lactic acidemia. And acidemia just means lactic acid in the blood. This can happen, this lactic acid fermentation, anytime that tissue in the human body or the animal body is poorly perfused. And by that I mean it's not getting enough blood flow. Remember, it's the blood It's the red blood cells in the blood that are delivering oxygen to tissue. And that oxygen is being delivered so that cellular respiration and oxidative phosphorylation can occur. So if you're in a particular disease state where your tissues are not getting enough blood flow, they're also not getting enough oxygen. And that's going to push the cells in that area to ferment using lactic acid fermentation. So when does this happen? Well, it can happen when there is a large amount of trauma to a particular tissue. So think about, for example, crush injuries. Think about a person that gets in a car accident, and as the car sort of crumples around them, it crushes into areas of their body and it crushes tissue. While that tissue is damaged, it will be poorly perfused, and lactic acid will be produced through fermentation for a little while. Massive blood loss will do this. So if a person gets injured and has a hemorrhage and loses a lot of blood, their blood cells can't deliver enough oxygen. So their whole body will be temporarily poorly perfused. Diabetes is another good example. Now I'm talking about uncontrolled diabetes here. So a person who is not taking their insulin correctly, or who's not taking insulin at all. A person who is not in control of their diabetes. Um, Diabetes leads to poor perfusion in certain parts of the body, particularly in the extremities. So down in the feet and the toes and in the fingers, um, in the regions of the kidney that are rich with capillaries, in the retina of the eye. These are places that become very poorly perfused in uncontrolled diabetics, and lactic acid can build up there. And finally, hypertension. In other words, high blood pressure. High blood pressure can prevent normal perfusion because high blood pressure damages capillaries. So if the capillary gets damaged, we can't deliver blood there adequately to that tissue. And so it will be poorly perfused, and lactic acid will build up there as a result. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is that second very common pathway of fermentation called ethanol fermentation. Human beings don't do ethanol fermentation, of course, neither do animals, but certain microbial cells are capable of doing this type of fermentation pathway. Yeast are a good example. In this pathway, the glucose molecule will continue down the glycolysis pathway, creating pyruvate, as we've seen before, and the pyruvate will be shunted down the ethanol fermentation pathway. This pathway is a little bit different from the lactic acid pathway. It uses different enzymes. The pyruvate doesn't go directly to ethanol either. At first, it will be converted into a molecule called acetaldehyde and a little bit of carbon dioxide. And then it will be the acetaldehyde that is converted to ethanol. It will be the acetaldehyde that accepts electrons from NADH, regenerating NAD+. Some final notes about fermentation. Fermentation is an inefficient way to make ATP compared to oxidative phosphorylation. And that's because fermentation makes ATP through glycolysis. Fermentation makes ATP through substrate level phosphorylation. And it's simply an inefficient process. In other words, you get less ATP for each glucose that passes through. Fermentation, in fact, produces just 2 ATP per mole of glucose compared with, again, somewhere between 30 and 36 ATP during oxidative phosphorylation. So that means that most organisms won't use the fermentation pathways if they can do oxidative phosphorylation instead. So as long as their final electron acceptor molecule is available, they will do cellular respiration and oxidative phosphorylation. I do want to mention, though, that there are some organisms, microbes, that can use both cellular respiration, oxidative phosphorylation, and fermentation equally well. In other words, they can switch back and forth between those two metabolic processes depending on the environmental conditions they find themselves in the moment. These microbes are called facultative microbes. And if you think about it, they have the best of both worlds because they can do both of these pathways very easily, very readily, depending on the circumstances that they find themselves in.